Tonight, we're diving headfirst into a world where beauty wasn't just painful, it was downright terrifying. Picture this. It's the Middle Ages, and if you want to be considered beautiful, you basically have to look half dead. Think ghostly pale skin, sunken cheeks, and eyes so shadowed they might as well be bruises. You probably wouldn't survive this, but don't worry, it's just a bedtime story. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know what time it is and where you're watching from. I always love seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a cold stone chamber, lit dimly by flickering candlelight. The air smells like beeswax and old wool, with an underlying metallic tang that might be from the copper basin in the corner, or something far more sinister. You sit before a warped bronze mirror, its surface reflecting a distorted version of yourself, trying to perfect your look. But what exactly is perfect in the 14th century? First off, if your skin has even a hint of colour, you're already behind. Pale skin wasn't just a preference, it was mandatory. It screamed wealth and virtue in a society obsessed with both. If you were tanned, it meant you worked outdoors like a peasant. Gross. But being pale wasn't enough. You needed translucent skin with visible blue veins running along your forehead and chest. That sickly, almost cadaverous appearance, that was peak attractiveness. This wasn't some gentle beauty ideal whispered between ladies at court. This was a cultural obsession that consumed the lives of medieval women, dictating every aspect of their daily existence. The pursuit of paleness became a religion unto itself, with its own rituals, sacrifices, and martyrs. Women would literally sacrifice their health, their comfort, and often their lives to achieve this ghostly perfection. So how did people pull this off? Mostly through a horrific combination of bloodletting and staying inside like a medieval vampire. You might smear on a thick paste of vinegar, crushed pearls, and lead to bleach your complexion. Yes, actual lead. It burned, corroded your skin, and eventually poisoned your bloodstream. But hey, you looked aristocratic doing it. The process of creating these deadly beauty pastes was an art form in itself. Women would age vinegar in clay pots for months, sometimes years, until it reached the perfect corrosive consistency. Pearls were ground to powder using pestles that had been blessed by priests, because even vanity needed divine approval. The lead, often salvaged from church windows or stolen from painters' workshops, was mixed in carefully measured amounts. Too little, and you'd look merely human. Too much, and you'd be dead before the season's end. One historical example that stands out is Queen Elizabeth of York. Portraits of her show an impossibly pale face, hollow cheeks, and dark eyes framed by a high forehead, all textbook beautiful for the time. But scholars argue whether these depictions were real or just artistic wish fulfillment. Maybe she looked like that, maybe she didn't. What we do know is that looking like death warmed over was a whole aesthetic, and women leaned hard into it. The Queen's beauty routine, as recorded by her ladies-in-waiting, was a daily exercise in controlled poisoning. Each morning began with a vinegar scrub so harsh it left her skin raw and weeping. Then came the ceruse, that deadly white paste applied with brushes made from the finest sable hair. The process took hours, and by the end, her face was a mask of toxic perfection that could crack if she smiled too broadly. But Elizabeth was fortunate. She had servants to apply the poison, physicians to monitor her symptoms, and the finest ingredients money could buy. For lesser nobles and ambitious merchant wives, the pursuit of paleness was even more dangerous. They mixed their own concoctions in dim kitchens, using recipes passed down through whispered conversations. One wrong measurement, one contaminated ingredient, and beauty became a death sentence. Now imagine trying to achieve that signature sunken cheek look in a time before contouring kits, you'd resort to actual starvation. Wealthy women were known to limit their food, not only to stay thin, but to maintain that slightly hollow, ethereal face shape. Some would even suck on lemons, or rub them on their skin, hoping the acid would drain some of the plumpness from their cheeks. Sounds made up, right? Nope. That's a real medieval beauty tip, passed from lady to lady in hushed, desperate conversations. The lemon treatment was particularly popular among young wives trying to maintain their pre-marriage appearance. They would wake before dawn, slice fresh lemons with silver knives, and press the acidic fruit against their cheeks until their skin burned and blistered. The theory was that the citric acid would melt away the fullness of youth, leaving behind the gaunt elegance that medieval society prized. The reality was chemical burns, scarring, and a constant throbbing pain that they bore in absolute silence. Let's not forget the role of artists in this madness. Medieval painters weren't exactly going for realism. The faces they painted were filtered through layers of religious expectation and class-based fantasy. Smooth, deathly skin wasn't just beautiful, it was holy. A pure soul had to live in a pure body, and that meant no flaws, no colour, no warmth. If you were lucky, the local painter would throw in some gold leaf to brighten up your halo. Otherwise, you were stuck looking like a very fashionable ghost. So you stare at your reflection in that blurry mirror, your skin stinging from the vinegar, your cheeks aching from being hollowed by fasting. The candle flickers, and you catch your face from a different angle, pale as moonlight, ethereal as mist, beautiful as death itself. Tomorrow, you'll do it all again, because in this world, beauty isn't a gift, it's a daily act of self-destruction, and you've become its most devoted practitioner. Your skin is sufficiently pale now, great. You've managed to look like a walking manuscript illustration of a ghost. But now it's time to tackle something even weirder. Your forehead. Yes, your forehead. Because in the Middle Ages, the higher it was, the hotter you were. And if you think today's contouring routines are extreme, get ready. Because now you're plucking back your hairline, literally, with tweezers, one hair at a time. This isn't a joke. The ideal medieval woman had a forehead that stretched halfway to her scalp. It was seen as a sign of intelligence, nobility, and spiritual purity. And to get that look, women plucked, shaved, or even rubbed their skin raw with walnut oil or bandages soaked in vinegar to make the hair fall out. Eyebrows? Gone. Baby hairs? Exiled. Sometimes they even shaved the top of their head back an inch or two, just to push that hairline even further. Think of it as the original five-head, and it was considered pure gold. The forehead obsession wasn't born in a vacuum. It was carefully cultivated by a society desperate to distance itself from anything resembling peasant labor. A low hairline suggested coarseness, a lack of refinement, perhaps even a connection to physical work, but a soaring expanse of pale flesh above the eyebrows. That was aristocracy made visible. It announced to the world that you were so elevated, so refined, that even your thoughts required more space. The idea behind this forehead fetish is still debated by historians. Was it rooted in actual beauty ideals? Or did it stem from religious iconography? Many depictions of the Virgin Mary showed her with a high, smooth forehead, no surprise, considering the church controlled most art and culture, so women were expected to model themselves, quite literally, after the divine. A smooth, expressionless brow symbolized a calm, controlled nature. You weren't supposed to look emotional. You were supposed to look serene. But achieving this divine appearance required a devotion that bordered on masochism. The process began in childhood, often as early as age 10, when young girls would be taught to pluck their hairlines for the glory of God and the honor of their future husbands. Mothers would sit with their daughters by candlelight, teaching them the proper technique. Grip each hair close to the root, pull quickly in the direction of growth, and never, ever cry, because tears would make the forehead puffy. Now imagine the daily maintenance. You sit by the hearth in the dim light of early morning, tweezers in hand, yanking out strands of hair while trying not to cry, because if you cry, your skin gets puffy, and then you'll have to smear crushed rose petals under your eyes to reduce the swelling. Beauty in this world is a job, and you don't get days off. The tools of forehead modification were as varied as they were brutal. Wealthy women employed specialized tweezers crafted by the finest metalworkers, their tips filed to pinpoint precision. These instruments were often blessed by priests before use, because even vanity required divine sanction. For those of lesser means, any sharp implement would suffice. Needles, fish bones, even sharpened pieces of wood. The pain was considered purifying, a daily penance for the sin of feminine vanity. There's a wonderfully strange case from medieval France involving a noble woman named Isabeau of Bavaria. According to legend and maybe some dramatized accounts, she plucked her hairline so aggressively that it permanently damaged the follicles on her scalp. For years afterward, she wore elaborate headdresses to hide the irregular patches. These headpieces got so big and heavy that they eventually caused neck problems. And no, they didn't have chiropractors back then, just prayer. Isabeau's tragedy became a cautionary tale, whispered among court ladies. But it didn't deter them. If anything, it elevated her to a kind of martyrdom. Here was a woman so devoted to beauty that she had sacrificed her very scalp for the ideal. Her damaged hairline became a badge of honor, proof of her commitment to the aesthetic standards of the age. Young girls would pray to achieve even half her dedication. Speaking of headgear, the high forehead wasn't working alone. It came packaged with elaborate wimples, hennins and snoods, all of which helped frame and emphasize the forehead. The hennin, that cone-shaped princess hat you've seen in fairy tales, was often worn tilted back so the forehead was front and center. Bonus points if your forehead was visibly veiny. That meant your skin was thin and delicate, like parchment, and everyone loved parchment. But the hennin served a darker purpose than mere fashion. These towering headdresses, some reaching 2 feet in height, were engineering marvels designed to draw the eye upward, away from any imperfections below. They required perfect posture, one wrong move, and the entire structure would topple. Women walked with books balanced on their heads for months to develop the necessary grace. The hennin wasn't just clothing, it was a daily test of worthiness. What's particularly cruel and kind of absurd is that even if you didn't have the right kind of forehead, you still had to pretend. Portrait artists would draw your face elongated and your brow exaggerated, whether you liked it or not. In fact, some modern historians now suspect that many of those ideal proportions in medieval portraits weren't real at all. They were edited, the way Instagram filters smooth out your features today. The more things change, right? But let's not forget the eyebrows they had to go to. Women tweezed them until only a faint shadow remained. This wasn't because they hated expression. It's because eyebrows were seen as distracting, even vulgar. A woman's face was supposed to be a clean slate, like a holy relic or a statue. Emotions were messy. Emotions made you human, and being human was kind of frowned upon. The eyebrow removal process was perhaps even more painful than the hairline plucking. The skin around the eyes is delicate, prone to swelling and infection. Women would apply numbing pastes made from crushed poppy seeds or willow bark before beginning their daily plucking ritual. But even these crude anesthetics could only do so much. Many developed permanent scarring, creating artificial ridges where their natural brows once grew. And here's a weird one. Some women didn't just stop at hair removal. They actually dyed their scalp and the remaining fringe of hair around the forehead to make the skin look even whiter by contrast. Imagine applying a layer of white chalk or powdered bone dust just above your eyebrows, so the whole face glowed with unnatural paleness. It wasn't flattering, it wasn't realistic, but it was expected. So, here you are again, sitting in your chamber, Your maid pulls gently at another hair near your temple. You grip the bedpost, exhale slowly, and try not to flinch. Your forehead now stretches impossibly high, smooth as polished marble, framed by the faintest suggestion of hairline. You look serene, otherworldly, untouchable. Tomorrow, you'll check for any new growth and begin the process again. Because in this world, beauty isn't just about looking good. It's about looking like you've transcended the very need to look human at all. Your forehead is now the envy of every noble woman from London to Lebec. You've sacrificed your eyebrows, your scalp, and probably your sanity, but you're finally achieving that prized look, a pale, expressionless canvas, ready to be admired and judged. But don't think you can relax just yet. Tonight we descend further into the mouth of madness. We're talking teeth, tiny, discreet, impossibly delicate teeth that never show, never smile too widely, and absolutely must not look like you've ever eaten anything harder than a grape. In medieval beauty lore, the mouth was a contradiction. It had to be there, obviously, but it shouldn't do much. No loud laughing, no toothy grins, no yelling across the courtyard because your goat got loose again. Lips were meant to stay closed, demure, mysterious, and teeth. The smaller, the better. Ideally, your teeth were white, small, evenly spaced, and invisible 90% of the time. If someone actually saw your teeth, you were doing femininity wrong. This standard was rooted in more than just aesthetic taste. It had moral implications that reached deep into the medieval psyche. A small, closed mouth was considered a sign of modesty and self-control, virtues that every woman was expected to embody. Large teeth or a wide mouth, by contrast, were associated with gluttony, vulgarity, and sometimes even sexual promiscuity. Women with big mouths were seen as loud, opinionated, or worst of all, unladylike. The goal was to seem like you barely existed, just a soft breeze of a person with delicate bone structure and no opinions. Fun times. The obsession with tiny teeth wasn't merely about size, it was about what those teeth represented. Small teeth suggested refinement, breeding, a life so cushioned by privilege that you never needed to tear meat from bones or gnaw on hard bread. Your delicate dental arrangement announced to the world that servants cut your food, that your meals were soft as silk, that you existed on a plane so elevated that even chewing was beneath you. There's a fascinating passage in a 14th century French romance where the male hero praises the heroine's beauty by saying her teeth are so fine and small they would not break the skin of a grape. Romantic, right? Unless you're eating steak, then you're doomed. It's hard to chew nobly when your teeth are functionally ornamental, reduced to decorative pearls in a mouth designed for appearance rather than purpose. Medieval oral hygiene, yeah, that was another nightmare altogether. They didn't exactly have Colgate. People used a mix of herbs, vinegar, salt, and even burnt rosemary ash to scrub their teeth, assuming they even bothered. Most commoners didn't. Among the elite, it was a little more common, but the focus was more on appearance than health. So while you might rub your gums raw trying to whiten your teeth, the idea of actually preventing tooth decay, that wasn't the priority. The daily dental routine of a noble woman was an exercise in controlled damage. She would begin each morning by rinsing her mouth with a mixture of wine and mint, not for freshness, but because the acidity was believed to dissolve stains. Then came the scrubbing, a paste made from ground eggshells, powdered coral, and honey, applied with a cloth wrapped around a wooden stick. The abrasive mixture scraped away not just stains but enamel, leaving teeth whiter temporarily but weaker permanently. Which leads us to one of the more ironic tragedies of the period. The women who tried the hardest to maintain their teeth often did the most damage. There are records of women using ground coral and brick dust to polish their enamel. Yes, brick dust. It looked good until their enamel was completely gone and their teeth began crumbling in their gums. The ultimate in medieval beauty, small, pearly teeth that eventually rotted out of your skull. but at least you looked pious doing it. One documented case from 13th century England tells of Lady Margaret of Wessex, renowned throughout the kingdom for her teeth like winter pearls. Her beauty routine, meticulously recorded by her confessor, apparently even dental care required spiritual oversight, involved daily applications of crushed brick mixed with wine. By age 30, her famous teeth had turned black and begun falling out. Rather than abandon the practice, she had the remaining teeth filed down to uniform size and covered them with thin sheets of silver when attending court. The effect was striking, if macabre a smile that literally glittered in candlelight. Then there was the matter of breath. You couldn't show off your tiny, perfect teeth with breath that smelled like boiled eel and sadness. So medieval women chewed herbs, often parsley, mint, or cloves. Some also used rosewater mouth rinses, which didn't do much medically, but at least covered up the evidence of a questionable diet. In some parts of Italy, women were known to chew fennel seeds and even sprinkle ground cinnamon into their mouths before social events. The breath-freshening rituals became increasingly elaborate as the stakes rose. Court records from Burgundy describe a beauty preparation called the sweet breath ceremony, performed by ladies in waiting before important gatherings. The process involved gargling with honeyed wine, chewing specific combinations of herbs in a prescribed order, and finally, coating the tongue with a paste made from crushed rose petals and sugar. The entire ritual took over an hour and had to be repeated if the woman ate or drank anything stronger than watered wine. But here's where it gets even stranger. There was an unspoken code about when a woman could show her teeth. A smile was allowed, but only the faintest, tightest version, something Mona Lisa level. No open laughter. That would reveal too much. Plus, joy wasn't considered especially feminine. You were supposed to look ethereal, slightly sad, like you were waiting for your husband to return from war or for God to call you home. Anything more enthusiastic than that risked being seen as inappropriate. There's even a fringe theory among historians definitely debated that upper-class women were sometimes trained to suppress laughter, the idea being that joy made the face contort, which could reveal teeth, deepen smile lines, or ruin the delicate balance of their powdered skin. Whether this was a formal instruction or just a result of relentless social pressure, we may never know. But the concept of facial restraint was very real. Beauty wasn't just about how you looked, it was about how still you could remain. Let's pause and consider. Imagine being a teenager in this world. Your friends are all trying to figure out how to make their teeth smaller and less noticeable. No braces, no whitening strips, just prayers and pumice. If you were born with crooked or large teeth, tough luck. You might be laughed at, avoided, or quietly pitied. Some wealthier families even went so far as to remove visible molars to make their daughters' mouths look smaller. The pain, the risk of infection worth it, apparently, for the chance of a good marriage. The surgical modification of teeth wasn't uncommon among the truly desperate. Traveling barber surgeons, the closest thing to dentists in medieval Europe, would file down prominent canines or remove teeth that disrupted the ideal small-mouth silhouette. These procedures were performed without anesthetic, often in dirty conditions, and frequently led to deadly infections. Yet women continued to seek them out, driven by a beauty standard that demanded the literal reduction of their ability to eat, speak, and smile. It wasn't all hopeless, though. Some medieval beauty manuals, rare ones, tucked away in monastic libraries, offered gentler remedies for whitening teeth and freshening breath without completely destroying your mouth. One such manuscript recommends rubbing sage leaves on the teeth and drinking wine infused with mint. That's one of the more reasonable tips we've heard so far. And yet, it's the quiet cruelty that lingers, the idea that you must silence your body to be seen as good. You had to shrink everything. Your voice, your mouth, your appetite. The smaller you appeared, Literally and metaphorically, the more perfect you became. So here you are again, sitting in your chamber. You haven't smiled in hours. You chew fennel seeds between meals and scrape your teeth with crushed eggshells. You avoid laughing, even when something's funny, because beauty in this time isn't joy, it's discipline. And if your teeth are starting to hurt, don't worry. That just means it's working. You're pale, hollowed, hairless in all the wrong places, and your mouth is small enough to pass medieval inspection. At this point, you should be golden, right? But no, because now comes the part that ties it all together, being thin. Not just thin, but fragile, ethereal, one skipped meal away from sainthood. Because in the Middle Ages, looking like you hadn't eaten in days wasn't just fashionable, it was holy. Fasting wasn't just for monks and mystics. Among noble women, not eating became a badge of both spiritual devotion and social superiority. The thinner you were, the more virtuous you were assumed to be. A woman with a full figure might be considered healthy, sure, but she was also suspected of indulgence, gluttony, or even moral weakness. The ideal body was soft but slight, delicate but shapely, like a sculpture that might break if you breathed too hard on it. This wasn't some quiet internal practice either. In many aristocratic courts, fasting was flaunted. Women would attend feasts, but barely touch the food, delicately sipping wine or picking at a piece of bread with exaggerated grace. It wasn't just about health, it was about power. Denying yourself pleasure, especially in public, sent a message: I am in control. I am closer to God. I am better than you. The medieval obsession with thinness emerged from a complex web of religious doctrine, social hierarchy, and genuine fear of the body's appetites. The church taught that flesh was inherently sinful, that physical desires led souls astray from divine purpose. For women, this message carried additional weight. Eve's appetite had damned humanity, so every woman's hunger was suspect. To refuse food was to refuse temptation, to demonstrate that your soul ruled over your flesh. But the spiritual aspect was only part of the equation. Extreme thinness also served as a clear class marker. Peasant women, who needed physical strength to survive their harsh lives, naturally carried more muscle and flesh. Their bodies bore the evidence of labor-strong arms, broad shoulders, sturdy legs. For the nobility, rejecting this robust physicality became a way of distancing themselves from the working classes. Fragility was luxury made visible. Now let's talk about St. Catherine of Siena. She's probably one of the most famous examples of religious fasting in the medieval era. Catherine claimed to survive for years on nothing but the Eucharist, literally, a piece of communion bread. Some historians today believe she may have suffered from a condition now recognized as anorexia, though obviously no one called it that back then. Her starvation was interpreted as divine devotion. She was canonized, and her image, gaunt, sunken, glowing, became part of the beauty and spiritual ideal for women for centuries. Catherine's story reveals the terrifying intersection of faith and self-destruction that defined medieval attitudes toward the female body. Her hagiography, written by her confessor, Raymond of Capua, describes her refusal to eat as a miracle, a sign of God's special favor. When she did attempt to consume food, she would reportedly vomit immediately, a response her followers interpreted as her body's holy rejection of earthly sustenance. Modern medical experts suggest she likely suffered from severe anorexia nervosa, but in her time, her condition was seen as proof of her spiritual elevation. And here's where it gets even murkier. Spiritual purity and physical appearance weren't just connected, they were indistinguishable. A woman who was naturally thin and pale could be seen as blessed, maybe even saint-like. A woman who had to work at it through starvation, herbs that induced vomiting, or long nights of self-flagellation was still admired, but with a different flavor of reverence. She was admired for her suffering. There are quirky tidbits too, like the popularity of something called holy anorexia. It wasn't a medical term, obviously, but a spiritual label applied to women who fasted to the point of hallucination and ecstasy. Some noble families even encouraged this behavior in their daughters, seeing it as a shortcut to sainthood, or at least a way to increase the family's religious prestige. That's right, starving your child could be a career move. The phenomenon of holy anorexia spread through medieval Europe like a dark contagion. Convents became breeding grounds for competitive fasting, where young nuns would vie to see who could survive on less. The practice was often encouraged by male confessors, who saw these women's suffering as spiritually edifying for everyone but the women themselves. Records from the convent of St. Clare in Assisi describe nuns so weakened by voluntary starvation that they had to be carried to prayers, their emaciated forms seen as living relics of devotion. And don't get the wrong idea, men were doing similar things, especially in monasteries, but it hit women differently. Fasting became not just a religious act, but a gendered performance. You weren't just purging your body of sin, you were proving that you were too holy for hunger, too pure for earthly needs. Your body wasn't yours anymore, it was a shrine. But let's rewind to the daily grind of it. Imagine waking up in your cold stone chamber with a roaring fire that doesn't actually do much. Your maid brings in your breakfast, a stale crust of rye and a cup of goat's milk, but you wave it away. You're fasting, which really just means keeping up appearances. Your head aches, your limbs are weak, but you smile faintly and go about your day. You faint during morning prayers. Everyone pretends not to notice. Among your circle of noble women, there's an unspoken competition. Who can eat the least? Who can go the longest between meals? Who can survive on herbs and broth and still stand upright at Mass? It's brutal, it's isolating, and it's revered. The competitive aspect of medieval fasting cannot be overstated. Court records from 14th century Burgundy describe fasting circles among noble ladies, informal groups that would monitor each other's food intake and provide both support and pressure for continued restriction. These women developed elaborate systems of accountability secret signals to indicate successful food refusal, coded language to discuss hunger without appearing weak, and rituals around the few morsels they did consume. Even the fashion of the time reinforced this. Gowns were tight around the ribcage and torso, emphasizing a narrow waist. Lacing was used to cinch the body, not yet full corsetry, but an early form of it. Some gowns had no stretch, and could barely accommodate a full breath, let alone a meal. The silhouette of the day was long, narrow, almost reed-like. Rounded curves were okay hips, and busts had their place, but the stomach had to be flat, the ribs discreet. Your whole frame was supposed to say, "I exist on air and prayer." The physical toll of these beauty standards was devastating, though it was rarely acknowledged in historical records. Women suffered from fainting spells, hair loss, tooth decay, and bone weakness. Many died young, their deaths attributed to spiritual ecstasy rather than starvation. The few medical texts that survive from the period describe symptoms we would now recognize as severe malnutrition, but medieval physicians often interpreted these signs as evidence of divine favor rather than physical distress. Scholars still argue about how far these standards actually reached. Were all noble women really starving themselves? Or were the ideals exaggerated by male poets, clerics, and artists, projecting their fantasies onto female bodies? There's definitely truth to that. A lot of what we know comes from second-hand sources. Men writing about women, artists painting exaggerated saints, religious leaders praising devotion while quietly destroying lives. But the physical evidence, where it exists corseted bones, letters, manuscripts, suggests that many women lived these expectations day after day. There were also class divisions, of course. Peasant women couldn't afford to fast, nor would anyone expect them to. They needed energy to survive their lives' fieldwork, childbirth, constant labor. But the higher up the social ladder you climbed, the more your plate had to stay empty. The irony. The rich had access to food and were praised for pretending they didn't want it. So now here you are again. It's dinner time in your candlelit hall. Your lord is eating roast pheasant. The smell is so rich it makes your stomach twist. You sip watered wine and pretend to be indifferent. Your gown is tight across your ribs. You haven't eaten a full meal in days, but everyone praises your lightness and your grace. You feel dizzy, and someone leans over and says, "You look radiant tonight." You manage a faint smile. You're starving, but that's the point. In this world, hunger isn't suffering, it's sanctity. And you've become its most devoted disciple. You've stopped eating, you've erased your eyebrows, and you've shrunk your mouth into a delicate, well-mannered smirk. But you're not quite finished, because now it's time to talk about the final and arguably most unachievable layer of medieval beauty: purity. Not just physical purity, but the big one, the one that loomed over every girl from the moment she could walk in a straight line. Virginity. And not the real-life kind either. We're talking about a fantasy version of chastity, spun together with threads of religious dogma, courtly love poetry, and more than a little wishful thinking. This is the virgin ideal in the Middle Ages. A beautiful woman wasn't just physically appealing, she had to look and act like she had never even heard of sex. And if she was married, well, ideally she still seemed virginal. The standard was ridiculous, ethereal, and untouchable. Graceful, but completely innocent. Mysterious, but also morally transparent. Basically, you were expected to be a walking contradiction in a really expensive dress. It all stemmed, of course, from the religious climate. The Virgin Mary was the ultimate role model. She was seen as the perfect woman, kind, obedient, selfless, and eternally untouched. Artists and poets bent over backward to make her the centerpiece of womanhood. That meant real women living, breathing, complex women were expected to mold themselves into that impossible shape. Pale, passive, and pure. Let's put you in the mindset. You're 13, maybe 14, old enough for marriage negotiations to begin. Your mother has already warned you to walk modestly, avoid eye contact with men, and never speak above a whisper, unless addressed directly. You've been taught how to sit with your ankles crossed, how to lower your eyes demurely, and how to say no with just the right amount of angelic confusion. You've also been warned that even looking too interested in anything, might make people think you're impure. Passion, after all, was suspicious. The training for this impossible standard began almost from birth. Young girls were taught to move like ghosts, to speak like whispers, to exist like suggestions rather than actual people. They practiced walking with books balanced on their heads, not for posture alone, but to cultivate an ethereal gliding motion that suggested they might float away at any moment. Their voices were trained to remain soft, and breathy loud speech was associated with market women and tavern wenches, not proper ladies. Even your clothing reflects this bizarre blend of innocence and allure. Your dress might be modest in cut, but made from expensive fabrics that whisper privilege. You might wear a veil over your hair, not just for fashion, but because visible hair was associated with temptation. The more covered you were, the more good you appeared. Modesty wasn't just suggested, it was legally enforced in some regions. Literally. In parts of medieval Italy, laws dictated how much skin unmarried women could show. Yes, they had purity police. These sumptuary laws extended far beyond simple dress codes. In some cities, young unmarried women were required to wear specific colors, usually white or pale blue, to signal their virginal status. Married women had different color requirements, and widows were restricted to black or brown. The penalties for violation could be severe: fines, public shaming, or even temporary imprisonment. Your clothing wasn't just fashion, it was legal documentation of your sexual status, enforced by municipal authorities who had nothing better to do than police hemlines and necklines. There's this fascinating story about Agnes of Rome, a 12-year-old girl canonized for refusing to marry and protecting her chastity to the death. Her legend became a popular tale for young women, taught as a lesson in devotion and moral superiority. In art, she's often shown with a lamb symbol of innocence and a face so expressionless you'd think she'd been mildly sedated. This, apparently, was the vibe everyone was supposed to emulate. Pure, passive, silent. And here's the kicker. Even your physical features were supposed to reflect your purity. Small nose, delicate and modest. Large eyes, great, as long as they didn't sparkle with too much curiosity. High, smooth forehead, of course, because nothing says virgin like an enormous blank canvas above your brows. Medieval writers described beautiful women with skin whiter than milk, hair like gold threads, and voices so soft they could not disturb a bird. That last one sounds poetic until you realize it basically means you shouldn't speak above a whisper, ever. But let's talk about hair for a second, because in medieval symbolism, hair was a loaded weapon. Loose hair on a woman was associated with seduction, danger, and lack of control. This is why brides wore their hair down only on their wedding day, symbolizing both virginity and transition. After that, it was covered or braided tightly, because leaving it loose would be like walking around with a neon sign flashing "might be a temptress." The hair regulations went far beyond simple covering. The way you arranged your braids, the tightness of your plaits, even the number of pins you used. All of these details carried meaning. A braid that was too loose suggested moral laxity. Hair that escaped from beneath your veil implied poor discipline. Some convents required novice nuns to shave their heads entirely, not just as a symbol of devotion, but as protection against the dangerous power of feminine hair. The rules were unspoken but rigid. You didn't want to be mistaken for a loose woman because the consequences were brutal. A woman suspected of sexual impurity could be shamed, disinherited, exiled, even killed. It didn't take much a rumor, a jealous suitor, an unfortunately timed encounter in a garden. Noble families' daughters were political currency, and if a girl's virginity came into question, it could sink entire marriage alliances. So yes, the pressure was real, and yes, it was constant. There's a strange scholarly debate about whether these purity standards actually affected women's day-to-day lives, or if they were just idealized projections from male-dominated literature and religious doctrine. On one hand, poetry from the era is overflowing with references to untouched maidens and flawless beauties. On the other, real women sometimes found ways to work the system. Some used their virgin reputations as bargaining chips. Others faked virginity with herbs and clever storytelling. A few even went full holy maiden and joined convents to escape the whole marriage mess entirely. The medical and pseudo-medical practices surrounding virginity were both fascinating and horrifying. Midwives developed elaborate techniques for restoring virginity through minor surgeries or herbal treatments, basically the medieval version of hymenoplasty. These procedures were dangerous, often performed in unsanitary conditions, but the social pressures were so intense that women risked infection, permanent injury, even death, rather than face the consequences of suspected impurity. A quirky historical tidbit. In some regions, midwives were trained to restore virginity through minor surgeries or herbal treatments. It wasn't common, but it happened. Reputation was everything, and people would go to extraordinary lengths to protect it. The irony is, devastating women were mutilating their bodies to conform to a standard that was already impossible, trying to become something they were never supposed to be in the first place. And yet, despite all these impossible expectations, women still laughed, gossiped, flirted, even loved. They wrote poems, traded secrets, and found moments of rebellion. That they did so behind veils, under layers of fabric, and always with one eye over their shoulder, because in the medieval world, being seen as impure wasn't just a gossip risk, it could destroy your life. So here you are, sitting in the garden under the careful gaze of your chaperone. You speak softly, hands folded, eyes lowered. You're 13, but you already know the script by heart. You must be beautiful, yes, but not too much. Innocent, but not naive. Seen, but not heard. You hear a giggle from behind the hedge, some other girl, less careful than you, maybe whispering with a page boy. You tense, not because you're jealous, but because you know how quickly that kind of thing becomes a story. And in this world, a single story can become your legacy. The virgin paradox wasn't just about sexual purity, it was about the complete erasure of female agency, dressed up in the language of virtue and protection. You were expected to remain untouched, not just physically, but emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. You were supposed to be pure enough for heaven, but desirable enough for marriage, holy enough for the church, but human enough to bear children. The contradiction was the point it ensured that no woman could ever truly succeed, could ever be beyond criticism or control. You've nailed the Holy Trinity, pale, quiet, and virginal. But something's missing. Your hair, your literal crown, isn't just dangling there by accident. No, in the medieval world, your hair color could make or break your entire existence. And if you were truly aiming for elite beauty status, only one color would do. Blonde. Not honey blonde, not brassy yellow, we're talking luminous, sun-kissed strands of spun gold, preferably glowing like a holy halo under candlelight. And if you weren't born with it, too bad. You'd just have to fake it, even if it meant burning your scalp with homemade bleach. This obsession with golden hair didn't come out of nowhere. In medieval Europe, blonde was shorthand for purity, youth, and heavenly grace. Artists painted angels and saints with flowing blonde locks, even if they were depicting women from regions where blonde hair wasn't exactly genetically common. The symbolism ran deep. Blonde meant divine, blonde meant delicate, blonde meant you'd probably die young, and wasn't that just lovely? The cultural mythology surrounding blonde hair reached almost religious proportions. Church frescoes depicted the Virgin Mary with golden tresses, despite her Middle Eastern origins making such colouring historically unlikely. Angels were universally portrayed with hair like spun sunlight. Even female saints, regardless of their actual geographic origins, were given blonde halos in artistic representations. The message was clear. Divine favour had a specific colour palette, and it didn't include brunettes. For brunettes and redheads, this was a problem, so women got to work with a variety of horrifying DIY treatments to lighten their hair. One method involved soaking your hair in a concoction of lye, alum, and stale urine. Yes, urine before sitting in the sun for hours. It didn't always work, but when it did, you'd end up with dried out, straw-like blonde strands and likely chemical burns. Beauty win, maybe? Nerve damage, possibly? The urine-based treatments weren't just desperate measures. They were based on legitimate chemical understanding of the time. Medieval scholars recognized that the ammonia in aged urine could strip color from hair, though they had no concept of the long-term damage they were inflicting. The most prized urine came from young children or pregnant women, believed to be more potent due to their pure nature. Noble families would sometimes employ servants specifically to collect and age these precious beauty ingredients. One particularly infamous beauty recipe comes from a 15th century Italian manuscript, instructing women to mix saffron, lemon juice, and goat's urine, apply it to the hair, and then sit outside with a wide-brimmed hat that had the top cut out, so just your hair would roast in the sunday. The goal: lift the pigment. The result: sometimes it worked, but usually it just fried your hair into a crispy halo of medieval regret. The process was as elaborate as it was dangerous. Women would begin their hair-lightening rituals before dawn, when the morning sun was gentlest. They'd sit in specially constructed chairs, with holes cut in the backs to allow their hair to hang free. Servants would apply the caustic mixtures with wooden combs, careful not to let the chemicals touch their own skin. The smell was reportedly unbearable, a combination of ammonia, sulfur, and decay that could be detected from several rooms away. And don't think you could just wear a wig. Wigs were rare and seen as theatrical or deceptive, plus extremely hot and itchy under layers of wimples and veils. Some women used thin veils dyed with golden hues to give the illusion of blonde hair peeking through, but it was no substitute for the real thing. You wanted the shine, the shimmer, the approval of everyone from your priest to your suitor. And if it cost you your scalp, so be it. The wig taboo stemmed from both practical and moral concerns. Practically, wigs were difficult to maintain and secure with the elaborate headdresses of the period. Morally, they were seen as a form of deception, presenting false beauty to the world. The church taught that God had given each person their natural appearance for a reason, and to dramatically alter it was to reject divine will. Better to slowly poison yourself with chemicals than to wear someone else's hair. A historical example. Let's talk about Lucrezia Borgia. While she lived slightly post-medieval, in the early Renaissance, her golden hair was so famous that it was sent as a diplomatic gift. Literally. Strands of her hair were preserved in jewelry and letters as tokens of power and allure. Whether it was her natural color or achieved through early bleach jobs is up for debate, but the point is clear. Golden hair meant influence. It turned women into legends, or at least well-married nobles. Lucrezia's hair became the stuff of legend, inspiring poems, paintings, and political negotiations. Ambassadors would write detailed descriptions of her tresses in their diplomatic reports, treating her appearance as a matter of international significance. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, reportedly spent enormous sums importing rare ingredients for her hair treatment: saffron from the Middle East, exotic oils from North Africa, even powdered pearls dissolved in wine. Of course, this aesthetic ideal excluded whole populations. Dark-haired women, especially those from Southern Europe or the Middle East, were often portrayed as seductive, dangerous, or morally ambiguous in medieval poetry. A dark-haired temptress usually spelled trouble for the hero, while the golden-haired maiden was the one he'd take home to his castle. The racial and cultural undertones here are obvious. Blonde wasn't just beautiful, it was seen as better. The literary reinforcement of blonde supremacy was systematic and deliberate. Courtly romance cycles consistently portrayed dark-haired women as foreign, exotic, and ultimately dangerous. They might be desirable, but they were never marriageable. Meanwhile, blonde heroines were described with language borrowed from religious texts, their hair compared to halos, their beauty linked to divine favor, their purity assumed rather than proven. Now here's where it gets interesting. While the church pushed for modesty and chastity, the romantic literature of the time courtly love tales, troubadour poetry fueled the obsession with blonde hair even more. In these stories, the perfect lady was always golden-haired, gentle, and mysteriously sad. Men fell to their knees for her, sang ballads under her window, or died in duels defending her honor. Blonde hair became the symbol not just of holiness, but of high drama. So naturally, women copied the ideal, even if they knew it was fiction, even if they knew it was dangerous. There's a documented case in 14th century England of a noble woman who went blind after accidentally getting bleach in her eyes during a hair lightening session. Her servants testified that she'd been trying to match the golden shade of a lady in a painting art imitating life, or life imitating art, with a side of permanent eye damage. The woman, Lady Eleanor of Westmoreland, spent her remaining years in darkness, but reportedly never regretted her attempt to achieve the perfect blonde shade. But the consequences weren't always so visible. Repeated chemical treatments led to hair loss, infections, and open sores on the scalp. And let's not forget the smell. Many of these bleaching agents, especially urine-based ones, left women smelling like a farm animal in high summer. You'd walk into court looking like Aphrodite, but reeking like the stables. The things people did for beauty. The olfactory assault of medieval hair treatments cannot be overstated. Court records from France describe visiting dignitaries complaining about the stench emanating from the ladies' quarters during hair days. Some castles installed special ventilation systems in the chambers where these treatments took place. Servants assigned to hair bleaching duty often demanded extra compensation for the hazardous and nauseating work. And still, it wasn't just about hair colour, it was about what that colour represented. You weren't just bleaching your hair, you were bleaching your entire identity. You were aligning yourself with a mythic version of womanhood, one that was unattainable for most and deadly for some. Blonde was a shortcut to grace, to love, to heaven, and it wasn't fair. But then, nothing about medieval beauty was. Historians still argue over how much pressure women actually felt to conform to these blonde ideals. Some scholars say it was mostly limited to elite courts and aristocratic circles, where women had both the time and the resources to ruin their hair for fashion. Others argue that the obsession trickled down into the merchant and middle classes, especially in cities like Venice and Florence, where visual culture was booming and appearance meant opportunity. There's even evidence that men played into this too, not with hair colour, but by writing endless odes to sun-haired maidens and golden angels. The poetic imagery set the bar, and women were expected to meet it. Never mind genetics, never mind chemistry, just bleach, pray, and roast in the sun like a delicate, glowing meatball. So now, back in your chamber, you sit by the window with your scalp still stinging. You've followed the recipe from that whispered beauty manual. The sun beats down through the open circle in your straw hat, your hair steams, and you smell faintly of lemons and livestock. A servant fans you lazily. You feel lightheaded, but maybe that's just the fumes. Later, at court, someone glances your way. Your hair catches the candlelight. It shimmers for a moment. You think, maybe this was worth it. Then someone else turns to look, and another. You smile faintly and tell yourself not to scratch your head, because it still really, really burns. At this point, you've probably figured out that medieval beauty was less about being alive and more about looking like you were slowly fading out of existence. But don't think for a second that this obsession with delicate looks meant people actually smelled delicate. Welcome to the rank underbelly of medieval beauty culture, where baths were rare, sweat was constant, and your nose was the unsung hero trying to get you through each day without fainting. First off, no medieval people weren't completely allergic to washing. They bathed more than the myth suggests, when they could. But for noble women, hygiene wasn't always about health. It was about optics. You were supposed to smell fresh and floral, yes, but without getting wet. Actual bathing was seen as potentially dangerous to the soul, or even harmful to fertility. Plus, medical experts of the time claimed that hot water opened your pores, making you more vulnerable to disease, sin, or both. Because nothing screams medical knowledge like blaming your bathtub for a plague outbreak. The medieval relationship with water was complicated by medical theory that would make modern doctors weep. Physicians believed that the body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that these needed to remain in perfect balance. Hot water was thought to disrupt this balance by opening the pores and allowing the humours to escape or evil vapours to enter. Cold water was slightly better but could shock the system and cause the humours to congeal. The safest approach, according to learned men who had never touched a washcloth, was minimal contact with water altogether. So what did women do instead of bathing? They perfumed. A lot. They doused themselves in rose water, lavender oils, crushed violets, and even spiced vinegar. Some stuffed their undergarments with dried herbs like mint, marjoram, and thyme, basically turning their corsets into medieval potpourri sachets. Linen shifts and veils were frequently laundered, more so than the body itself, in a constant attempt to trick people into thinking cleanliness was happening. The herb stuffing practice became an art form among the wealthy. Noble women employed specialist herb gatherers who would collect specific plants at optimal times, mint picked at dawn for freshness, lavender harvested under a full moon for potency, rosemary blessed by priests for spiritual cleansing. These herbs were then sewn into small silk sachets and strategically placed throughout the clothing, at the bust for breath freshening, at the waist to combat body odor, and at the ankles to perfume the air as they walked. And then came the masks. No, not COVID style, but scent masks. Perfumed gloves, pomanders, small perforated balls filled with aromatic resins, and even garlands worn around the neck or pinned inside dresses. These weren't just decorative, they were olfactory armor. The upper classes understood that things stank. The key was to stink better. Pomanders represented the height of medieval scent technology. These intricate metal spheres, often made of silver or gold and decorated with precious stones, contained compartments filled with different aromatics. Ambergris from Wales, musk from civets, exotic spices from the Far East. The wealthy spared no expense in their war against natural human odor. Some pomanders were so elaborate they resembled miniature architectural marvels, with rotating chambers that could release different scents throughout the day. Let's talk about hair, since we just tortured it in the last section. If you thought scalp care was a modern obsession, think again. Medieval women often went weeks without washing their hair. Instead, they rubbed it with scented oils to mask the natural build-up. Rosemary, clove oil, and bay leaves were popular choices, not for cleanliness, but to convince people your head hadn't turned into a small ecosystem. One quirky tip from a 14th century beauty manual recommends boiling rosemary and wine and using the mixture to rinse the hair and cheer the brain. Sounds nice, until you remember how often lice made themselves at home in those braids and veils. Delousing was a constant, itchy battle. Women used special combs, vinegar rinses, and prayers, lots of prayers. The lice problem reached epidemic proportions in medieval courts, where elaborate hairstyles and head coverings created perfect breeding grounds for parasites. Professional lice pickers, usually elderly women with sharp eyes and steady hands, were employed by wealthy households. These specialists developed sophisticated techniques for removing lice and their eggs without disturbing the carefully constructed hairstyles that took hours to arrange. Some even used tiny silver implements designed specifically for lice extraction, proof that even parasites received the luxury treatment among the nobility. Now, not everyone could afford the luxury of smell-masking oils and herbs. For poorer women, especially in the cities, public bathhouses were a more realistic option, until the church decided they were too sinful, because apparently bathing in the same room as other people was a gateway drug to lust, disease, and moral collapse. Many bathhouses were shut down or heavily regulated, and women were expected to wash modestly at home using a basin, a cloth, and whatever level of shame they could muster. But here's where things get contradictory again. The same society that scolded women for washing too much also expected them to look and smell immaculate, not just passably clean, but spiritually fragrant. Writers of the time would describe their ideal women as smelling like lilies, honey, or spring rain. Never sweat, never food, never, God forbid, reality. And of course, the pressure to smell right wasn't evenly distributed. Noble women were held to impossible standards. You were expected to sit through hours of court, layers of heavy clothing, stuffy rooms, and still somehow radiate the scent of divine approval. One wrong whiff, and suddenly the gossip started. She's been riding too much, someone might whisper, or worse, she's not what she pretends to be. One historical figure worth mentioning here is Isolde of Brittany, the often overlooked foil to the famous Isolde in the Tristan legend. She was praised not just for her golden hair and pale skin, but for smelling like flowers even after travel. Whether that was poetic metaphor or just the result of an extreme perfume habit, we'll never know. But the idea stuck. The perfect woman didn't just look good, she smelled like a meadow in May. Of course, there's a scholarly debate around how seriously we should take all this. Some historians argue that medieval people were far more pragmatic than the surviving beauty manuals, suggest that maybe the pressure to stay fragrant wasn't quite so dramatic. Others point to court documents, letters, and poems that obsess over scent as evidence that yes, this was a big deal. And when you consider how rare bathing was, it starts to make sense. In a world full of natural funk, smelling even slightly better than average could be a social power move. But let's move on to the really serious stuff, your skin cream. And by cream, we mean a bubbling cauldron of ingredients so toxic that even your local apothecary raises an eyebrow. Tonight, you're diving into the glamorous and horrifying world of medieval makeup, where lead, mercury, arsenic, and vinegar were casually mixed into something you smeared directly onto your face. Let's start with ceruse. Sounds elegant, doesn't it? Like some French artisanal paste sold in a boutique. In reality, ceruse was a thick white paint made from vinegar and white lead, aged in clay pots until it congealed into a smooth, deadly cream. Women used it to achieve that perfect no blood circulating here look. Ceruse covered freckles, blotches, and the overall stress of surviving in a world with no antibiotics or civil rights. It made you look angelic. It also made your skin peel off in strips if you wore it too often. The production of ceruse was a dangerous industry unto itself. Specialized workshops, usually located downwind from populated areas due to the toxic fumes, employed workers who rarely lived past 40. The process involved exposing thin sheets of lead to vinegar vapors for months, creating a corrosive white substance that was then ground into powder and mixed with various binding agents. The workers, almost exclusively women from the poorest classes, suffered from lead poisoning, respiratory problems, and premature death. All so noble ladies could achieve the perfect pale complexion. One documented case involved a noble woman in England who used ceruse daily to maintain her famously pale complexion. Eventually, her skin became so raw and damaged that she had to have her maid apply it for her, avoiding open wounds. Did she stop using it? No, of course not. Beauty standards wait for no one. She simply upped the dosage to mask the damage caused by the product itself, a vicious loop centuries before Instagram filters. And lead wasn't the only villain. Mercury too had its moment in the spotlight. It was found in spot removers designed to fade blemishes, age spots, or any sign of sun damage. The cream was applied at night, often while wearing a mask or wrapping your face in cloth so the product could work its magic. Magic here meaning nerve damage, tremors, hallucinations, and eventual organ failure. But hey, anything to get rid of that one freckle that keeps showing up when the light hits just wrong. Mercury treatments were often prescribed by traveling physicians who claimed expertise in cosmetic medicine. These charlatans would arrive at castles and manor houses with elaborate cases filled with mysterious potions and instruments. They spoke in impressive Latin, quoted ancient Greek texts, and charged enormous fees for treatments that were essentially slow-motion assassination. Many of their clients developed what we would now recognize as mercury poisoning: shaking hands, tooth loss, personality changes, and eventual madness. Now you're probably wondering, Did everyone use this stuff? Number ceruse and mercury-based creams were mostly used by the elite because they were expensive and difficult to make. But where nobles led, others followed. Merchant-class women copied the look with watered-down versions chalk and flour pastes, or ground-up alabaster mixed with egg whites. None of it was skin-friendly. All of it got into your pores and probably shortened your life by a few years. What's fascinating and disturbing is how deeply these concoctions were linked to morality. Smooth white skin was more than just pretty, it symbolized virtue, wealth, and a soul untouched by worldly sin. Women who had scars, moles, or tanned skin were seen as morally suspect. There was even a belief that beauty on the outside reflected beauty on the inside. A clean white face meant a clean white soul. It's the original good vibes only aesthetic, except enforced with death paste. But wait, it gets worse. If your skin started to show the side effects of the poison you were rubbing on it daily, you'd be expected to hide that too. Blistering? Try a blend of rose water and crushed pearls. Skin turning grey? That's when you pulled out the rouge, a toxic red dye made from cinnabar, aka mercury sulfide. That's right. To hide the effects of one poison, you applied another. Eventually, your whole routine was just chemical warfare happening in slow motion across your face. So now, back in your room, you open your small wooden box. Inside, your ceruse, your powdered cinnabar, your chalk, your oils. You look in the mirror, your skin is blotchy, your cheeks raw. You dab, you blend, you smooth. You create the illusion of health, virtue, perfection. Later, as you walk through the halls, someone comments, "Your skin is like ivory." You smile and try not to think about how, by 35, your teeth might fall out, and your bones could start to ache for reasons no one understands yet. But tonight, you're glowing. You're ready to make everyone in court assume you were just too delicate to exist in this cruel, cruel world. You were ready to make everyone in court assume you were just too delicate to exist in this cruel, cruel world. This ideal wasn't just about looking unwell, it was about hinting at something deeper. A woman who looked physically weak was often assumed to be emotionally sensitive, artistically inclined, and spiritually advanced. Men wrote poems about their lovers as fading roses, melting snow, and ghostly maidens. You weren't supposed to be of this world. You were supposed to look like you were barely tolerating it. Now here's the creepy twist. The beauty of the sickly look blurred the line between life and death. It wasn't uncommon for women to be compared to corpses in love poems. She lay still as marble, one poet wrote, her breath so light it stirred not the air. Romantic, right? Also mildly terrifying. But this was the mood you didn't just want to look passive, you wanted to look perishable. A perfect example of this can be found in the court of Burgundy, where pale skin and sorrowful expressions became something of a competitive sport. Ladies would faint during church services, swoon during dances, and recover just in time to offer a small, trembling smile. One noble woman reportedly claimed to drink only rose water for an entire week before a royal banquet, so her skin would appear bloodless and divine. She didn't eat, she barely moved, and she made a huge impression. The cultivation of artificial frailty became an elaborate performance art. Women practiced their fainting techniques, learning to collapse gracefully without damaging their elaborate gowns or headdresses. Some employed servants specifically trained to catch them during their delicate moments. The timing had to be perfect too early, and you looked attention-seeking. Too late and you missed the dramatic impact. Court records from Burgundy describe ladies spending hours rehearsing their swoons, treating fragility as a skill to be mastered. Scholars still debate how much of this was conscious performance versus actual illness. After all, medieval Europe was crawling with diseases, and nutrition wasn't exactly balanced. A lot of women were genuinely unwell. But instead of worrying about that, Society just aestheticized it. The line between sick and stylish blurred to the point where real health problems became a kind of fashion accessory. And if you think this trend faded with time, think again. The idealization of the suffering woman persisted well into the Renaissance, the Romantic period, and yes, even modern pop culture. There's something disturbingly timeless about a culture that praises a woman most when she's silent, fragile, and barely hanging on. The consumptive chic wasn't limited to natural pallor and strategic fainting. Women actively enhanced their sickly appearance through makeup techniques designed to suggest illness. They would use berries or beetroot to gently darken the under-eye area. That's right, they created the illusion of eye bags on purpose. Anything that made you look more tragic, more otherworldly, was fair game. One particularly dramatic beauty trick involved gently pressing a cold spoon under the eyes to encourage slight swelling and bruising. The result: a soft, puffy under-eye shadow that whispered, "I haven't slept in days, and I've been weeping about my lover who died in the Crusades." Combine that with a fluttering fan and a strategically placed lace handkerchief, and you had achieved the ultimate in medieval melancholy chic. The cold spoon technique required precise timing and technique. Too much pressure would create obvious bruising that looked more like domestic violence than delicate suffering. Too little would have no effect. Women would practice on their maids first, perfecting the pressure and duration needed to achieve that perfect "I'm dying of love" look. Some even used small silver implements, specifically designed for this purpose, crafted by jewelers who had apparently run out of useful things to make. Back in your chamber, you examine your face in the polished bronze mirror. You've applied your white powder, a touch of crushed berries beneath your eyes, and your lips are tinted just enough to suggest you might have coughed blood recently, tastefully, of course. You lie back on your velvet daybed, draping an arm over your forehead with soft, theatrical flair. Later, in the great hall, someone leans over and whispers, "You look so delicate tonight, almost like you're not really here." You smile faintly. That's exactly the look you were going for. But now let's shift focus, because this whole beauty circus wasn't limited to women. Allow me to direct your tired eyes to the young men of the medieval courts. No, they didn't get a free pass. Sure, they weren't bleaching their scalps with goat urine or smearing mercury under their eyes. But trust me, medieval masculinity came with its own punishing list of requirements. Tonight, let's talk about the impossible standards for men too, because if you think your corset's tight, imagine trying to look brave, rich, and holy while surviving hand-to-hand combat. Start with the basics. The medieval dreamboat. He's tall, but not so tall that he looks awkward. He's lean but muscular, ideally a kind of wiry strength, like a sword with abs. His face, sharp, clean-shaven, with a high forehead. Yes, they plucked hairlines too. A straight nose, and clear, unblemished skin. His hands, delicate but calloused in just the right places. You wanted to look like you read poetry by candlelight, but could still murder a guy before breakfast. So how did men keep their skins smooth and their features sharp in a world with no barbershops, no safety razors, and a medical system that thought sneezing too hard might summon demons? The answer: very carefully, and often painfully. Upper-class young men used tweezers to shape their brows and remove stray facial hairs. That's right, medieval manscaping. Some even used vinegar-based tonics to cleanse their skin and avoid breakouts, since pimples were seen as signs of weak character or excessive lust. The male grooming routine was surprisingly elaborate and time-consuming. Young nobles would wake before dawn to begin their beauty preparations, which could take 2 hours or more. They used pumice stones to smooth rough skin, applied oils to soften their hands, and spent considerable time arranging their hair with primitive styling products made from animal fat and tree resins. The goal was to appear effortlessly perfect, while investing enormous effort in maintaining that illusion. But beyond the face, A young nobleman's entire identity was wrapped up in his body and what he did with it. From childhood, he was trained for war, sport, and the extremely formal art of looking cool on a horse. This wasn't about health or fitness the way we think of it now. It was about image. Knights and squires were judged by how they carried themselves in armor, how gracefully they moved during a dance, and how well they recited romantic poetry to a lady without tripping over their own tights. And yes, tights were very much a thing. In fact, men's fashion during the later Middle Ages was just as tight, restrictive, and oddly revealing as anything women wore. Men wore hose that outlined their legs and buttocks in excruciating detail. Codpieces became so exaggerated in some courts that laws were eventually passed to tone them down. A well-dressed man might spend just as long as his female counterpart getting ready, smoothing down his hair, adjusting his doublet, selecting his colours. Appearance was everything, and failure to look the part could ruin your chances of court success. One real historical figure who fit and broke these rules was Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince. He was the medieval poster boy for knightly perfection. Skilled in battle, handsome, rich, well-dressed, and tragically doomed. His early portraits show a man with the classic look, strong nose, soft curls, and a fashion sense that screamed, "I'm ready for war, but also ready to pose for an oil painting later." Illness ravaged him, and by the time he died young, he had morphed into exactly the kind of tragic male beauty medieval society adored. Noble, broken, unreachable. But the pressure on men wasn't just aesthetic. It was deeply moral and deeply performative. You had to be brave, yes, but not too emotional. Devout, but not boring. Courteous, but ready to fight to the death at a moment's notice. Every glance, every bow, every word spoken at court had to walk a tightrope of masculinity so narrow it made women's standards look almost flexible by comparison. And of course, there were consequences. Men who couldn't meet these expectations were mocked, dismissed, or worse, accused of being effeminate. In some medieval courts, a man who dressed too elaborately or spoke too softly risked being labelled unmanly, a vague but dangerous insult that could threaten your social standing. In a society that prized hierarchy and conformity, not fitting the mold was risky business. There's even a fringe theory still debated by historians that the rise of courtly love poetry was as much about controlling men as it was about romanticizing women. These poems painted male lovers as gentle, suffering, noble souls who worshipped their lady from afar. Sounds sweet, until you realize it created an impossible role model. Real men were expected to act like fictional ones, chasing unattainable women while suppressing all the very human messiness underneath. You couldn't just be in love. You had to perform love like it was an art form and a test of character. Quirky side note. Some medieval men wore beauty patches, tiny silk spots stuck to the face to cover blemishes or signal a certain fashion forwardness. Yes, they stole that one from the ladies. A patch on the cheek might say, "I'm flirtatious." A patch near the eye, "I'm dangerous but poetic." And somewhere, some knight in full plate armor was carefully placing a silk sticker on his nose and praying it didn't fall off during the joust. Of course, not every man had the luxury to worry about aesthetics. Peasant men were too busy trying not to starve. But in the elite world of castles and courts, looks were capital. A young man's prospects could rise or fall on the curve of his cheekbone or the shine of his boots. And once again, beauty wasn't just about attraction, it was about moral worth. A clean face meant a clean soul. A well-groomed knight was a godlier knight. And if you bled out on a battlefield looking attractive, even better. So here you are. Let's say you're a young lord this time. You've bathed, shaved, plucked, oiled, and laced yourself into hose so tight you're walking like you've just dismounted a warhorse. Your hair is curled, your collar is stiff, and your sword is mostly for show. You head to the great hall where ladies flutter fans and men pretend not to look exhausted. Someone claps you on the back and says, "Looking sharp today, like a painting come to life." You nod, smile slightly, say something poetic about the moon, then walk away making sure your cloak billows behind you just right. The performance never ends, for men or women. Beauty in the medieval world wasn't about being yourself. It was about becoming a living artwork, a walking symbol of virtue, wealth, and divine favor. And if that symbol happened to be dying slowly from lead poisoning or fainting from hunger, well, that just made it more precious, more worthy of admiration, more proof that you were too refined for this crude, earthly existence. The performance never ends, for men or women. But let's get back to the ladies, because naturally, these clothes weren't breathable. So underneath all that finery, you were sweating constantly. And since you couldn't take off your gown in public, you just marinated in your own exhaustion. Your waist ached, your back cramped. You fanned yourself while pretending not to suffer, because suffering was part of the look. You weren't supposed to be comfortable, you were supposed to look transcendent. Of course, there were exceptions. In private, noble women sometimes wore looser gowns, especially when pregnant or ill. But even then, the standards lingered. If guests came by unexpectedly, you'd better be ready to relace yourself and slap on a veil. Your body was a billboard, and every curve or wrinkle was up for interpretation. Now here's a quirky little detail. Some young girls were introduced to lacing as early as age 12. It wasn't always tight at first, but over time, the laces got snugger and the expectations grew heavier. The message was clear. Start early, learn to tolerate discomfort, and become one with your body cage. It's tradition. But this tradition wasn't just uncomfortable, it was systematically designed to control and reshape the female form according to societal demands. The early precursors to corsets, known as coats or kirtles, were engineered with a precision that would make modern shapewear manufacturers jealous. These garments required servants, patience, and a willingness to exhale for no one. The goal was always the same: to make the body conform to the ideal, a long, narrow torso, a small waist, gently sloping shoulders, and modestly rounded hips. Not too curvy, not too strong, just enough femininity to suggest you were capable of bearing children, but not enough to imply you might be good at it. The daily process of getting dressed was an exercise in controlled suffocation. Your maid would first help you into a linen shift. Then came the kirtle, which had to be carefully laced to create a cinched-in waist and an elongated torso. You couldn't just pull one on like a comfortable hoodie. These things required help, servants, patience, and a willingness to grip the bedpost while someone yanked on the laces behind you. Often, the cords would dig into the ribs or bruise the sides if pulled too tight. Linen shifts worn underneath helped reduce chafing, but not much. One real-world account comes from the household records of the Duchess of Berry, whose ladies-in-waiting reportedly spent up to an hour a day dressing her just the torso section. Her undergarments had to be adjusted multiple times depending on the activity of the day. Sitting for long hours, slightly loosened, public procession, pulled tighter to present a figure worthy of devotion. Translation: she needed to look like an elegant, tortured saint on wheels. The Duchess of Berry's wardrobe accounts, preserved in the French National Archives, provide a fascinating glimpse into the mechanical precision required for medieval beauty. Her dressing routine involved no fewer than 4 servants, one to hold the kirtle, one to manage the lacing, one to adjust the fabric, and one to ensure the final silhouette met court standards. The entire process was choreographed like a religious ceremony, with specific prayers recited at each stage to ensure divine blessing on the day's appearance. And here's a wild little twist. In some cases, these garments weren't just form-fitting. They were actually reinforced with stiff materials like reed, whalebone, or even metal strips. These weren't corsets yet, but they were moving in that direction. The fashion was evolving, the torture intensifying. By the late 15th century, some bodices were so stiff women couldn't bend at the waist. You didn't sit, you reclined. If you dropped something, you waited for a servant to pick it up. God forbid you needed to run, but that was the point. Running wasn't beautiful. The reinforcement materials were sourced from across the known world, each with its own supposed benefits. Whalebone was prized for its flexibility, allowing for some movement while maintaining structure. Reed was cheaper but prone to snapping under pressure, sometimes injuring the wearer. Metal strips, usually iron or steel, provided the strongest support but could rust against the skin, causing infections and permanent scarring. Women wore these instruments of constraint as badges of honor, proof of their commitment to the ideal feminine form. And we haven't even touched on the layers. Over the tightly fitted kirtle, you'd wear a gown, sometimes two. The outer gown might weigh 10 or 15 pounds, with heavy embroidery, jewels, and thick velvet sleeves that swept the floor. The idea wasn't to move gracefully. It was to move like someone being slowly ushered towards sainthood. Slowness was beauty, stillness was grace, movement was for peasants. But just when you think you've mastered the art of looking beautiful while slowly suffocating, along come the fashion police literally. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws, medieval fashion regulations, where dressing too well could land you in legal trouble. Let's start with the basics. Sumptuary laws were regulations, often passed by monarchs or town councils, that controlled personal expenditures, especially clothing. These laws were meant to preserve moral order, but let's not sugarcoat it. They were mostly about keeping the lower classes in their place. You couldn't just wear silk because you liked the way it shimmered. You had to earn your silk by birth, marriage, or divine appointment. And if you dared to fake your status by dressing too well, that was fraud apparently, fraud via fashion. For example, in 14th century Florence, women of the merchant class were forbidden from wearing belts made of gold or silver. In England, under Edward III, no one below the rank of a knight's daughter was allowed to wear fur. Let that sink in. Your entire body could freeze solid during a particularly nasty winter, but if your father didn't own a certain amount of land, you'd better suffer stylishly in wool. Because if you wore fur anyway and got caught, you could be fined, shamed, or in some cases, stripped of the offending garment on the spot. Nothing says maintaining social hierarchy like being forcibly undressed in public. The enforcement of sumptuary laws was surprisingly systematic and brutal. Cities employed clerks whose sole job was to patrol streets, markets, and churches, taking notes on who wore what like a medieval version of Joan Rivers with a citation pad. These fashion inspectors carried detailed charts listing which fabrics, colours, and accessories were permitted for each social class. They had the authority to stop women in public, examine their clothing, and issue fines or confiscation orders on the spot. And then there were the colour restrictions. Certain dyes, like Tyrian purple or saffron yellow, were so expensive and symbolic that only the elite could wear them. Blue, associated with the Virgin Mary, was often reserved for nobility or clergy. Red was tricky or rich, dark reds were considered regal, while bright reds were sometimes linked to sin or sensuality. So, a woman wearing a crimson gown might be seen as either powerful or scandalous, sometimes both, depending on who was doing the judging. It wasn't just about what you wore, it was about how much of it you wore. Layering was a big deal in medieval fashion, and the more layers you had, the more affluent you appeared. But too many layers, too much embroidery, too many jeweled accessories that could be seen as vanity or, worse, arrogance. And vanity, as we all know, was a fast track to eternal damnation. There was always that balancing act. Display enough beauty to seem virtuous, but not so much that you looked proud. God forbid anyone thought you enjoyed looking nice. Even headwear came under scrutiny. The hennin, the famous cone-shaped hat, was so closely associated with aristocratic women that some towns banned its use among the bourgeoisie. Imagine being fined because your hat was too pointy. Some cities had clerks whose sole job was to wander the streets, taking notes on who wore what, like a medieval Joan Rivers with a citation pad. A particularly bizarre case comes from 15th century Venice, where a woman was fined for wearing pearls sewn into the lining of her sleeves, not even visible inside the sleeves. But the logic was that hidden luxury still encouraged pride and vanity, even if no one else saw it. It's like they were policing your intentions, thought crime, but make it fashionable. The Venetian case reveals the psychological sophistication of medieval control mechanisms. The authorities understood that true compliance required internal acceptance of the restrictions, not just external conformity. By punishing even hidden displays of luxury, they sought to eliminate the very desire for beauty and status. The woman in question, Elisabetta Morosini, became something of a folk hero among Venetian women, who began deliberately hiding small luxuries in their clothing as acts of quiet rebellion. And these laws didn't apply only to the lower classes trying to climb the ladder, they also targeted women in general. Authorities feared that if women were allowed to dress too lavishly, they might become unruly, seductive, or worst of all, difficult to control. So laws were passed specifically to limit what women could wear on feast days, at weddings, or during public festivals. Some towns even required widows to wear dull colours for the rest of their lives, because clearly grief isn't official until it's colour-coded. Now, there's a fringe theory among some historians that sumptuary laws weren't really enforced all that strictly, that they were more about sending messages than issuing punishments. In some cases, that's probably true. But in others, enforcement was very real and very public. Officials would patrol markets and churches, keeping an eye out for fashion infractions. Tailors could be fined for making clothes above the client's station. A dressmaker might be dragged into court just for adding too much lace. And let's talk about lace. Intricate, handmade, often imported lace was one of the clearest signs of wealth in a woman's wardrobe. But if you were caught wearing too much of it without the appropriate pedigree, you'd better have a convincing excuse. One London woman claimed she inherited her lace from a noble cousin she was still fined, probably because no one believed a cousin would part with lace. But here's the contradiction that made such laws so exhausting. Everyone was still expected to look nice. You had to be fashionable, refined, elegant, but within limits. It was like being told to paint a masterpiece with half your colours banned and your brush under surveillance. Women were particularly vulnerable to this paradox. They were judged constantly by clerics, by men, by one another, yet denied access to the very tools that would help them succeed in those judgments. And underneath it all was fear. Fear that blurred class lines would cause chaos. Fear that beautiful women would lead men astray. Fear that too much fabric or too fine a trim would awaken some dark, anarchistic impulse in the village square. Sumptuary laws weren't about modesty, they were about control. And like most systems of control, they punished the ambitious, the imaginative, the out of place. So now let's imagine you standing before your wardrobe, a beautiful carved chest full of linens, velvets, and silks. You pick out a gown. It's elegant, but modest. A little embroidery at the cuffs, a tasteful belt. You slip it on, smooth it down, and wonder, will anyone think this is too much? Too little? Too bold? Later, as you walk through the market square, a clerk gives you a glance. Not a smile, not a scowl, just a look. You nod politely, keep walking, and pray your belt isn't too shiny, your lace isn't too obvious. Your entire existence isn't too much for the fragile sensibilities of a world determined to keep you small, controlled, and perfectly, legally beautiful. You nod politely, keep walking, And pray your belt isn't too shiny, your lace isn't too obvious, your entire existence isn't too much for the fragile sensibilities of a world determined to keep you small, controlled, and perfectly, legally beautiful. But let's say the lavender oil didn't quite do the trick, and your natural medieval musk is getting ambitious. No worries, because this is where you reach into your little wooden cosmetics chest and pull out the really serious stuff, your age-defying arsenal. But here's the part they don't put in the love ballads or paint into the court frescoes. Beauty fades. Always. And in a world obsessed with your physical perfection as proof of your spiritual worth, aging wasn't just a natural process, it was a kind of public failure. Let's get right to it. Aging was terrifying, not just for the person experiencing it, but for the people watching. That youthful face meant you were closer to purity, closer to marriageability, closer to divine favor. As soon as that youth began to slip wrinkles near the mouth, crow's feet at the eyes, a little extra softness at the jaw, you could feel yourself sliding down the social scale. And for women especially, the descent was swift, cold, and merciless. The medieval concept of beauty was tied almost entirely to youth. Girls were married young, often as early as 12 or 13, not only because of strategic alliances, but because that's when they were considered most attractive. Gross? Absolutely. But in the logic of the time, a girl's physical freshness was directly linked to her spiritual and social value. Once she began to age, often by her early 20s, she was no longer an ideal but a relic. Aging men had more wiggle room, of course. Grey hair on a man? Distinguished. A lined face? Evidence of wisdom and hard-earned experience. But a woman with similar features? Often pitied, mocked, or feared. Older women were pushed out of the centre of court life, replaced by younger, more suitable beauties. A lady who had once been adored might find herself sidelined, no longer invited to dances, ignored at feast tables, or referred to with the gentle but soul-puncturing label of matronly. What made this even crueler was that women were still held to the same behavioural standards. You had to remain graceful, modest, sweet, and now invisible. If you tried to hold on to your beauty through makeup or elaborate dress, people talked. If you let it go, they still talked. You were either desperate or decaying. There was no winning. The transition from beautiful to past her prime could happen almost overnight in medieval society. Court records from various European kingdoms show how quickly women could fall from favour once they showed signs of aging. A duchess who commanded attention at 25 might find herself relegated to supervising younger women's wardrobes by 30. The speed of this social death was deliberate. It served as a constant reminder to all women that their value was temporary and conditional. Let's talk beauty treatments, yes. There were anti-aging methods, though none of them were kind. Women used harsh exfoliants made of crushed eggshells and salt to scrub away wrinkles. They dabbed their faces with mixtures of honey, vinegar, and ground bone to tighten the skin. Some even applied animal fat to fill out sagging cheeks. Nothing like waking up in the dark, cold centre of a stone castle and slathering yourself in goose grease just to pretend you're still 20. There's a peculiar account from 15th century France of a noble woman who insisted her maid stretch her face every morning using silk threads tied behind her ears. It didn't work, of course, but for a brief hour, before gravity pulled everything back into its rightful place, she could convince herself she was still the belle of the court. That illusion was everything. The face-stretching technique became surprisingly widespread among wealthy women desperate to maintain their youthful appearance. Specialized servants, often former seamstresses with steady hands, were trained in the delicate art of facial manipulation. They used silk threads, so fine they were nearly invisible, anchored to small hooks sewn into the backs of elaborate headdresses. The process was painful, and the results temporary, but for women facing social extinction, even an hour of artificial youth felt like a reprieve. And let's not forget the wigs. While not as popular in the medieval period as they would later become, some older women wore padded hairpieces or dyed their hair with increasingly desperate recipes: onion skins, ash, crushed insects, whatever could bring a little life back to strands that had gone white with time or tension. But here's the cruel twist. Many of these treatments damaged the scalp, causing hair to fall out faster. So the harder you fought aging, the more obvious it became. The wig industry, such as it was, operated in the shadows of medieval society. Hair merchants collected tresses from young women, sometimes purchased, sometimes stolen from the dead, and fashioned them into elaborate pieces for older clients. The trade was considered somewhat unsavory, dealing as it did in the literal remains of youth and beauty. Some religious authorities condemned wigs as deceptive, arguing that they represented a rejection of God's natural aging process. And then came the social whispers. An older woman showing too much pride in her appearance might be accused of vanity or, worse, witchcraft. Yes, you read that right. There was a common belief that older women who seemed too alluring or too confident were using unnatural means to preserve their looks. Unnatural being code for uncomfortable reminder that beauty doesn't die quietly. In one German village, a widow was accused of bewitching young men with her lingering charms. Her crime? Wearing red ribbon in her hair at 50. The accusations escalated when she was seen applying what witnesses described as mysterious ointments to her face. Likely just the same herbal remedies younger women used, but somehow sinister when applied by a woman past her perceived expiration date. The witch trials of medieval Europe were inextricably linked to societal fears about aging women. Women who refused to fade gracefully into invisible obscurity became targets. The stereotype of the witch-old, ugly, vindictive wasn't accidental. It was a warning to women about what happened when you outlived your beauty without accepting your diminished status. Court records from witch trials frequently mention the accused's appearance as evidence of guilt: hooked noses, wild hair, unnatural vitality in old age. Scholars still argue whether this fear of aging was truly universal. Some believe older women, particularly widows, gained social freedom after their looks faded, no longer under the control of a husband or the pressure of courtly flirtation. They could own property, manage estates, and even speak their minds. There's truth in that, but it came at a cost. You had to sacrifice desirability to be taken seriously. You had to disappear from beauty before you could emerge as a person. There's also evidence that some women leaned into this invisibility. They dressed simply, kept their heads down, and played the long game. They became quiet powerhouses, advising younger women, manipulating marriage contracts, influencing politics behind heavy veils and soft voices. In some ways, aging became its own kind of weapon, but again, only if you stopped trying to compete. The wise woman archetype emerged partly from this social dynamic. Older women who accepted their invisibility could sometimes transform it into a different kind of power. As midwives, herbalists, or advisors, they operated in the margins of society where their age became an asset rather than a liability. But this transformation required a complete abandonment of traditional feminine beauty, a kind of social death and rebirth that many women couldn't or wouldn't undergo. And in art? Forget it. Older women were rarely painted unless they were saints, beggars, or allegories for sin. In the rare portraits that do exist, they're often shown with downturned eyes, heavily veiled faces, or hands clenched in prayer, an eternal apology for having lived past their moment. There's even a strange genre of medieval literature called beauty confessionals, rare, but they exist where women documented their perceived flaws. A woman might write of her dull eyes or coarse hands, not to lament them exactly, but to express guilt, as though her lack of beauty were a failing she owed penance for. Imagine apologizing to God in your evening prayers because your cheekbones never developed properly, or because time had the audacity to leave its mark on your face. One such confessional, discovered in a monastery library in northern France, belongs to a woman identified only as Marie, widow of Tours. In her carefully penned text, she catalogues her physical deterioration with scientific precision. My skin, once praised as moonlight, now bears the stains of age. My hair, once gold as wheat, hangs grey and lifeless. I confess these failings before God and ask forgiveness for the vanity that once made me proud. The document is heartbreaking in its internalized shame, a woman apologizing for the crime of growing older. So tonight, you're sitting at your vanity. You see a faint crease near your eye that wasn't there last month. You touch it gently. Your maid notices, pretends not to. She brings over a bowl of cooled rosewater and a cloth. You press it to your cheek as if it might erase time. Later, at the feast, you watch the younger women laugh and dance. One wears a gown like yours from 10 years ago. Another carries herself the way you once did. Shoulders proud, lips modestly painted, eyes sharp with the confidence that beauty brings. You've been perfectly contained, face framed, jaw wrapped, body cinched, and you're still passing inspection. But you can feel it, beneath the layers of silk and meaning. Time. It's patient, relentless, and utterly indifferent to your powder and prayers. Tomorrow, there might be another line, another grey hair, another small surrender in your war against the natural order. And in this world, where a woman's worth expires with her youth, each day becomes both a performance and a countdown. A desperate attempt to remain visible in a society determined to erase you, one wrinkle at a time. Tomorrow, there might be another line, another grey hair, another small surrender in your war against the natural order. And in this world where a woman's worth expires with her youth, each day becomes both a performance and a countdown. But before we let you drift off into that inevitable invisibility, there's one last twisted layer to this medieval beauty nightmare we haven't fully explored. The role of death itself in the pursuit of perfection. Because here's where the story gets truly macabre. Some of the most celebrated beauties of the medieval world were corpses. Let's step into the candlelit quiet of a monastery chapel, where behind glass and gold lies the preserved body of Saint Clare of Assisi. Her skin, nearly 800 years after death, is said to maintain the translucent quality that medieval women tortured themselves to achieve. Her lips retain their delicate pink hue. Her hands are folded in eternal prayer, and her face bears that serene, otherworldly expression that no living woman could sustain for more than a few minutes without cramping. This wasn't unusual. Medieval Europe was obsessed with the beauty of holy women after death. The more perfectly preserved, the more divine their supposed virtue. These saintly bodies became the ultimate beauty standard. Eternal youth, perpetual pallor, and permanent silence. They couldn't age, couldn't disappoint, couldn't develop opinions or bad breath or morning hair. They were the perfect woman, finally and forever. The cult of beautiful corpses reached extraordinary heights during the high medieval period. Churches competed to house the most aesthetically pleasing saints, and their preserved remains drew pilgrims from across Europe. These dead women became tourist attractions, their beauty frozen in time and elevated to divine status. Living women were expected to emulate not just their spiritual devotion, but their physical appearance, the impossible task of looking like a perfectly preserved corpse while still being alive. The process of saintly preservation was itself a form of beauty treatment. When a woman died in the odor of sanctity, literally smelling like flowers instead of decay, her body was carefully prepared by specialist nuns who understood the art of holy embalming. They used combinations of spices, oils, and prayers to maintain the corpse's appearance, sometimes for decades. The goal was to create an eternal beauty that would inspire devotion and, not coincidentally, donations to the church housing the relic. But let's step back from the chapel and into the artist's workshop. because the medieval world's obsession with impossible beauty wasn't just about real bodies, it was systematically reinforced through the images that surrounded women every day. Medieval art wasn't trying to capture reality, it was manufacturing fantasy, creating visual instruction manuals for how women should look, behave, and aspire to disappear. Walk through your family's gallery and you'll see what I mean. Painted eyes follow you down the corridor, ancestors you've never met, each more flawless than the last. Gowns that seem to float, eyes that never blink, skin so smooth it looks like polished marble. None of them look like real people, and none of them look like you. But all of them tell you what you should be. The production of these idealized images was a sophisticated industry. Portrait artists maintained detailed pattern books filled with approved features. The correct nose shape, the proper eye spacing, the ideal mouth proportions. When commissioned to paint a noble woman, they would often work from these templates rather than from life, creating a standardized version of beauty that bore little resemblance to their actual subject. The goal wasn't accuracy, it was aspiration. Take the famous Lady and the Unicorn tapestries, for instance. Each panel shows a woman in a surreal, symbolic garden surrounded by animals, jewels, and elaborate florals. Her features remain almost identical across all 6 works, same pale face, same calm gaze, same mysterious smirk that practically says, "I've never pooped." She's not meant to be a person, she's meant to be an ideal. A walking, breathing, barely breathing, embodiment of everything medieval society expected from the perfect woman. The unicorn tapestries were more than decorative art. They were educational tools, visual textbooks that taught viewers about proper feminine behavior and appearance. Each gesture, each facial expression, each detail of clothing was carefully chosen to reinforce specific ideals. The lady's downcast eyes demonstrated modesty. Her pale skin suggested spiritual purity. Her elegant posture indicated noble breeding. Women who viewed these tapestries weren't just admiring art, they were receiving instruction in how to perform femininity. But these artistic ideals weren't limited to wealthy patrons who could afford custom tapestries. Churches were filled with images of impossibly beautiful saints and biblical women, each one reinforcing the same narrow definition of feminine perfection. Manuscript illuminations showed Mary Magdalene with flowing golden hair and flawless skin, even as she performed penance in the desert. The Virgin Mary appeared with the same ethereal features in countless paintings, her beauty so consistent across different artists and time periods that she became a medieval beauty template. The Church's role in promoting these impossible standards cannot be overstated. Religious art served as medieval society's primary visual media, reaching every social class and geographic region. When peasant women gazed up at painted saints during Mass, they absorbed the same beauty ideals that tormented noble ladies in their private chambers. The message was universal. Divine favor had a specific look, and deviation from that look suggested spiritual deficiency. Even more insidious was the way these artistic standards created a feedback loop with real life. Portrait artists would paint noble women with exaggerated features, longer necks, higher foreheads, more ethereal expressions, whether the subject possessed these traits or not. This wasn't deception, it was expected. One 15th century Italian merchant's letter to a portrait artist politely requests that the painter brighten the lady's eyes, lessen the nose, and improve the posture. Basically, make her hot, but tastefully. The artistic editing process was surprisingly sophisticated. Painters developed techniques for elongating necks, smoothing skin, and adjusting facial proportions using perspective tricks and careful shading. They could make thin women appear even more delicate, and give sturdy peasant features an aristocratic refinement. Some artists specialized in this kind of cosmetic portraiture, commanding premium prices for their ability to transform ordinary women into idealized beauties. But the cruelest aspect of this artistic manipulation was its psychological impact. Real women could never live up to these painted versions of themselves. They would sit for portraits and then spend years trying to match the impossible standard their own commissioned image had created. The painted lady on the wall became a constant reproach, a reminder of how far short reality fell from the ideal. There's a documented case of a Flemish noblewoman who became so obsessed with matching her portrait that she began sleeping in the same position depicted in the painting, hoping to train her face into the serene expression the artist had given her. She reportedly spent hours each day practicing the exact tilt of head and set of mouth shown in her commissioned image, treating her own portrait as a beauty tutorial. The influence of artistic ideals extended beyond individual portraits to shape entire cultural movements. When manuscript artists began depicting biblical heroines with specific features, pale skin, blonde hair, small mouths, these became the standard for feminine beauty across Europe. Young girls grew up seeing the same face repeated in religious texts, tapestries, and church frescoes, creating a unified and utterly unrealistic beauty standard that transcended geographic and cultural boundaries. Scholars still debate how much medieval people understood the artificial nature of these images. Some argue that viewers recognized them as symbolic rather than realistic, while others believe many people genuinely expected women to look like the painted ideals surrounding them. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. People understood that art was stylized, but they still internalized its messages about what constituted perfect beauty. The most tragic aspect of this artistic propaganda was its durability. Unlike fashion trends that changed seasonally, painted beauty ideals remained constant for centuries. The same elongated proportions, ethereal expressions, and impossible perfection stared down from castle walls and cathedral ceilings generation after generation, creating a timeless standard that no living woman could achieve. So here you are, walking through your family's gallery at midnight, candles flickering against painted faces that have watched over this corridor for decades. You pause before the portrait of Lady Eloise, your great-grandmother. Her face is still and pale, lips faintly curved in a smile that's probably just the artist's flourish. She looks perfect. She looks nothing like the stories you've heard about her temper, her sharp wit, her very human struggles with the same impossible standards you face. You reach up and touch your own face. Your skin is warm. Your eyes are tired from a day of performing beauty. You're very much alive. And somehow that feels like a rebellion against these painted phantoms who never age, never disappoint, never reveal the effort behind their eternal perfection. Tomorrow you'll return to the rituals of powder and lacing, but tonight, in this gallery of impossible women, you understand something profound. The most beautiful thing about you isn't your resemblance to these painted ideals. It's your refusal to disappear into them completely. The painted eyes seem to follow you as you leave the gallery, but for the first time, you don't feel their judgment as condemnation. You feel it as pity for all the women, real and imagined, who became prisoners of an ideal so perfect it could only exist in paint and dreams and the cold, still beauty of the grave. The painted eyes seem to follow you as you leave the gallery, but for the first time, you don't feel their judgment as condemnation. You feel it as pity for all the women, real and imagined, who became prisoners of an ideal so perfect it could only exist in paint and dreams and the cold, still beauty of the grave. But before we close the heavy oak doors on this medieval beauty nightmare, there's one final twist to consider. Not every woman played by the rules. Some figured out how to turn this impossible system into a weapon. Let's talk about Agnes Sorel, mistress of Charles VII of France, often cited as one of the earliest women to wield her beauty like a political instrument. She wasn't noble by birth, but she rose rapidly through court ranks by being unapologetically magnetic. She wore pearls, she wore fur, she wore gowns with necklines so low they made bishops sweat. She painted her face, powdered her skin, and made sure her presence was unforgettable. She was both adored and hated, proof that power in a woman's body made people very nervous. But Agnes didn't just look the part. She played the court like a harp. She used her access to the king to gain influence for her family, promote loyal allies, and secure herself a lifestyle so lavish that chroniclers complained she wore the cost of a chapel on her sleeves. She's even credited with helping lift Charles out of a depressive slump during the 100 Years' War. That's right. While men swung swords, she lifted morale with a carefully timed smile and the glint of sapphire earrings. Agnes understood something that most noble women couldn't say out loud. If you were going to be judged on your appearance anyway, you might as well choose the stage, control the lighting, and own the script. She transformed the very beauty standards that imprisoned other women into tools of liberation, or at least tools of influence. Of course, not all power came from such proximity to royalty. In Venice, the the honest courtesans, were a class of educated, alluring women who blurred the lines between beauty, wit, and influence. These weren't average tavern companions. They knew poetry, philosophy, fashion, and how to walk into a room like they owned it. Men didn't just want to bed them, they wanted to be near their intelligence, their culture, their carefully curated mystique. These Venetian women understood the performance aspect of medieval beauty better than anyone. They weaponized the very standards that oppressed other women, turning pale skin and golden hair into calling cards for intellectual salons where they hosted discussions on philosophy, politics, and art. They dressed in gold-threaded gowns and spoke in calculated tones, their beauty carefully curated but their minds just as sharp. But here's the catch that haunted even the most successful of these women. The power was always conditional, always temporary. Agnes Sorel was rumoured to have died from poison, possibly administered by jealous rivals. Many courtesans ended their lives in quiet poverty, exiled once their beauty faded. Even when women succeeded through beauty, the success came with an expiration date stamped invisible across their foreheads. The fundamental cruelty of the system remained intact. You could play the game, but you never owned the board. The moment you stopped being desirable, or the moment you became too powerful, you were erased. Just another cautionary tale in a monk's angry diary. And now, here's the uncomfortable truth we need to face. We inherited this madness. Scroll through social media, and you'll see the medieval mindset everywhere, dressed in new clothes but singing the same old song. No makeup tutorials designed to make you look effortless. Photoshopped portraits claiming to be authentic. Beauty products sold with promises of virtue-clean beauty, pure formulas, natural glow. We're not calling it piety anymore, but the language is hauntingly familiar. The technology changed, but the psychology didn't. We still believe, somewhere deep in our collective unconscious, that how we look somehow tells the world what kind of person we are. Good skin equals good character. A slim waist suggests self-control. Aging gracefully means using the right serums while pretending you don't care about aging at all. And don't even get started on the modern version of the impossible Virgin Mother paradox. You're supposed to be confident, but not arrogant, sexy but not slutty, natural but flawless, aging but timelessly. You should eat whatever you want but stay thin. Work out constantly but make it look effortless. Be ambitious but still nurturing. Sound familiar? That's a straight-up remix of medieval contradictions, now available in your social media feed 24 hours a day. The filtered photos, the ring lights, the careful angles, these are our modern tapestries, just as artificial and just as damaging as anything hanging in a medieval castle. The difference is that now the impossible standards follow us home, live in our pockets, and update in real time. Medieval women had to deal with one portrait painter's impossible expectations. We get to be judged by algorithms designed to keep us scrolling, buying, and doubting ourselves. But here's what those medieval women, the ones who survived, The ones who thrived, the ones who found ways to game the system can teach us. Beauty standards are just that, standards, not natural laws. They're invented, enforced, and perpetuated by systems that benefit from our insecurity and our compliance. Agnes Sorel figured that out 500 years ago. The Venetian courtesans built careers on it. Even the women who played by the rules found small moments of rebellion, tiny acts of self-determination within the constraints they inherited. The most radical thing you can do then or now is to recognize that your worth isn't tied to your appearance, your age, or your ability to disappear gracefully into someone else's fantasy. Those women in the painted gallery? They were prisoners of an ideal so narrow it could barely accommodate a human being. You don't have to be. You've survived the centuries. You've outlived every beauty standard that promised to define you. You've outlasted the plucked hairlines, the corseted ribs, the sickly pale faces, the saintly smiles, the powdered lies. You, sitting here in whatever year you're reading this, are proof that beauty does not own you. So go ahead, turn off the ring light, close the beauty app, put down the mirror, let the lines come if they want to. Keep your curves or change them, but do it for you, not for the ghost of some medieval monk still whispering across centuries that your body is a moral report card. You can decide what your reflection means. You can choose to love yourself for something deeper than skin deep, not as a saint, not as a seductress, not as a symbol of virtue or vice, but as a person with a heartbeat and a story that's still being written. The medieval beauty nightmare is over. You survived it, you learned from it, and now you can wake up.